So this may look potentially familiar, and that's because it's another version of the green android that I made a while back. Now, when I made that sculpture, I had a bunch of ideas I wanted to incorporate into it, and I just never quite found the time, or they didn't quite fit. So having 4 arms was something I really wanted to put on the original model, but it didn't quite work with the design I was going for. Similarly, the robot wearing clothes was another idea that I wanted to incorporate. I've always liked that idea because it's sort of slightly counterintuitive. I mean, why on earth would a robot need to wear clothes? And it sort of makes you think about why that might be, you know, and it's quite an interesting detail. I ultimately didn't do it because if you start adding clothes to your robot, then it starts obscuring all of the detail you've put into the piece in the first place, so it sort of seemed a bit of a shame to hide all of that work. Another idea I had for the original piece was that it would have masks, kind of a blank face thing, and once I sculpted up the face for the robot, I started thinking, well, if I put a mask on it, obviously you can't see the face, and that's going to be a waste of all the time that I've spent actually sculpting up this face. So then I started thinking, well, maybe it could have a mask that would raise and lower periodically with a servo, so for a while I was thinking maybe it would be automated in that way, but ultimately I decided not to go with it and just go with a open face, so I was very keen to include a mask for this piece. I also wanted to incorporate another robot in the base from the previous sculpture as well, and again I just think I ended up with too many ideas, so that led me to think, well, I've got all the moulds for this, I've got all the individual pieces, so there's nothing to stop me putting another version together and incorporating those ideas. So that's what I'm going to do in this video. So what I've done is to start pouring up some additional casts from the original moulds from the first robot, because this thing's going to have 4 arms, there's obviously quite a few more pieces than the original one had. Something I learned from putting the original piece together was that it takes quite a long time and it's quite tricky to get the pose right. Now, one thing I didn't include on this is a turning point in the centre of the thigh. If you ever looked at an action figure, they often have a pivot in the middle of the thigh to allow the leg to move sideways. And the reason they do that is because if you don't have it, then you can't properly angle the leg. Now, I don't have that in my piece, so what I'm actually having to do is file down the joints of the leg to allow the legs to orient properly in the right way. And it's a bit of trial and error really. It's quite difficult to get something that looks natural, so I spent quite a lot of time going back and forth on this trying to get the pose correct. The original version that I made had a lot of machined brass in it, and that's something I'm not doing this time round, so I'm actually using some more resin casts here for pivot points, and these are just some 15 and 20mm tubes that I've made some moulds of and poured some resin in. It's quite a nice way to work, so resin's very easy to work, so you can easily file it down and cut it and shape it however you need. So here's the beginning of me working out the pose for the legs. I'm just trying to find something that looks natural. I kind of want the robot to be stalking forward to give it a kind of menacing look. So I'm just trying to work out how the pose should be. As you can see on this knee joint, the pieces don't properly align, so this is what I was talking about. Trying to get the angles for all of the joints correct for the pose that you're going for is actually quite tricky, so I'm going to have to do a little bit more filing on that to try and get it to sit correctly. Now, a major part of the previous version was the torso had a lot of exposed mechanics in it. It had some pistons and wires and that sort of thing. I'm not going to do that for this. I'm going to give it a solid body, but in order to allow me to easily repose the piece, what I'm going to do is put a piece of aluminium bar in here, and the reason that's there is because the aluminium will bend. I can use it to repose the model if I need to, so if the pose doesn't quite work out, I can just re-angle the torso with that, so that gives me a degree of flexibility and means the pose isn't fully finalised. I've continued experimenting with the pose, and as you can see the legs are in a slightly different pose now, and again it's meaning that the pieces aren't lining up even further, so that's going to be more sanding to get them to sit correctly, but I do like the way that looks. I think it's a bit more natural and there's a bit more motion to it, so I think that's looking pretty good. I deliberately left a lot of the pieces blank when I made these, with the idea that I would be cutting in further detail into the cast resin once I'd had them cast up. So that's what I've continued to do here, and it's quite useful because it does allow me to differentiate the design of this robot quite far from the original one. So what I've done here is to scratch in some additional panel line detailing with this scriber, and as you can see on this piece I've marked out where those panel lines are going to go in pencil. The way I've done that is just with a short ruler with some blue tack on the side so it doesn't slide about too much. So I can now come in with my scriber and start scratching in those panel line details. I also use a piece of plastic that I can bend to the contours of the cast piece, so that's just a good way of getting a straight line on a curved surface. And once again I just put some blue tack on the back so it doesn't slide about too much. So here's a quick test assembly of the robot. For some reason I really like the look of robots with 4 arms, I'm not quite sure why, I just think it looks quite good. And the shapes on the back that I originally turned into sort of heat exhausts on the original piece, I always thought that these would also be useful for mounting an additional set of arms. So I always had that dual use in mind even when I was making the original piece. So I'm now turning my attention to making the mast for the head. So what I'm going to do is cover the cast of the face in foil, and that's just so I don't mess up the details from the cast. I can then cover that in Super Sculpey and start sculpting up the shape of the piece I need. I've tried to get the shape of the Sculpey sculpture as smooth as I possibly can, but the cool thing with Sculpey is once you've cooked it and it's hard, you can then sand it down even further to get a nice smooth finish. So this has had a few sanding passes on it, and I've also given it a layer of undercoat and filled in any imperfections where I've found them. So that's now looking pretty good, so I can now go ahead and make a mould of that. So there's my mould, and I've just made a pretty quick and simple mould with this. So I've given it a plaster mould jacket just to hold everything in place, and I've poured in some rotocasting resin. So it's now set, so I can now take out my cast. Okay, not looking too bad, needs a bit of clean up, but I think that's going to be okay. And there we go, that seems to fit pretty well on the face, so that's good. Something that I also want to do is to make a solid piece for the abdomen. I'm thinking this can just be a sort of a black sort of plastic type shape with some additional detail on top of it. So to do that I'm just going to take some polystyrene and cut that to shape, and then I'm going to sculpt over that with some Super Sculpey. So I've now sculpted that down, and I've deliberately made it thinner than it needs to be. So what I'm going to do is wrap it in some foam just to give it some additional detail. So there's the abdomen piece that I've made, and I've just added a few additional pieces of foam to that, and also some pieces of white plastic to add some additional detail. I've also made a shoulder pad here, and I actually made several casts of the mask just so I could have a few goes at it. So what I've done is to cut that down to make a sort of a shoulder pad. So it was a nice easy way of creating that without having to make something else from scratch. I've also cut some additional detail into the front of the mask there, so my thinking here is that I'm going to have an LED in that hole in the centre, which should look quite nice I think. I've also started making some hands as well. Now obviously with 4 arms that means I need 20 fingers, so there's quite a large casting session there to create the hands, and I actually end up wearing the mould out pretty much I think, because the casts I started getting out at the end of the process were looking much more ropey compared to ones that I did at the beginning. So I guess that's to be expected, you know, silicone moulds do degrade over time. What I've also done is to sort of make a cloak for the sculpture here, so I was putting that in place, and I'm really just doing this for a bit of a test fitting. As you can see, the model is ultimately going to be holding a sort of a staff on the side as well, so I'm just sort of putting this all together to get an idea of how the final piece will look. So I'm now turning my attention to what the staff should look like. I don't know why, but I started thinking it should probably be some sort of massive scythe type thing. I guess I was thinking of some sort of anime character or something like that, but I just figured something completely outlandish would look kind of cool. So I've just cut some pieces of cardboard out here to try and get an idea of what the size of this should look like. And also I wanted it to look different to the robot. I didn't want it to look like it was part of the robot's design, as though the robot was made to hold this thing. I wanted this to look like separate, as though the robot had acquired it at some stage in its past. So I don't know, maybe this thing became sentient and sort of broke away from its original function, and then for whatever reason decided to have a massive scythe. I guess you can rationalise that however you like. I just figured a giant scythe would look pretty cool, so that's what I'm doing. So now that I've got the shapes roughly worked out, I can start building this out of plastic, and I'm just using a bunch of resin shapes that I've cast up over the years. I've mentioned before that I've got boxes of these. Every time I do some resin casting, I just pour all the excess resin into a mould, so I end up with loads and loads of these shapes. So they're really useful for scratch building, sort of mechanical looking things. Right, so that's what I've come up with. Crazy looking scythe, and I think that's looking pretty cool. Right, so now that I've got this basically worked out, I can now start putting it apart into its component bits and get it ready for painting. Now, given that I've gone for a white paint scheme here, this is going to end up looking quite battered. Obviously white's going to pick up dirt quite easily, so I'm going for quite a weathered look, so I'm just painting in some chipped metal and damage across the model. I always find this stuff looks good on the edges and around panel lines. So I can now come in with some black paint and start darkening the panel lines to make those stand out a little bit more. And I'm now coming in with some black paint in the airbrush, and I'm just using that to add some additional shading. Something I do for a lot of these is to mask off certain areas around where the panel lines are. Just give a very light shading on one panel. Just helps break up the shape of the model and gives a bit of a variation in colour. Gotta admit, I do love this orange and white colour scheme. I've used it in various combinations over the years. I just think it looks really cool, looks quite industrial. So I really like the way that looks once it's got some chip paint on there and some weathering. So as I mentioned, something that I wanted to incorporate in the original piece was another robot lying on the base, and that really just came about because I've got the moulds, so I thought I may as well use them as much as I can. So I thought it looked quite nice if there was another broken or defeated robot lying on the base. I didn't really have space for it and ran out of time on the previous version, but I wanted to do it for this one. So I'm just cutting the torso down a little bit to make sure that fits into the base more easily. I also wanted to try and incorporate a bit more 3D printing into some of my projects. I haven't used my 3D printer all that much. I did my Space Marine recently, but I haven't used it much more than that. Part of a barrier for me in that I'm not that good at 3D modelling, so it doesn't come naturally to me, so it does hold me back a little bit. But I wanted to try and include a bit in this project, so I was thinking that perhaps this version of the robot might actually have wings. Now, I haven't got time to do a whole winged version of this, but I thought it might be quite nice if you could see some of those wings protruding from the base, as though this robot had been defeated by the other and was sort of half buried in the base. So that's what this 3D printed bit here is. It's sort of to imply the existence of wings for this version of the robot. And I'm going to give this one a face mask as well, but I want to have it broken as though it's been in a fight. So I'm just going to break off some of the pieces of the mask here to reveal the face below. And actually the resin breaks really nicely here, so I'm getting quite a nice shattered look to this, so that looks pretty cool. So I'm giving this a metallic orange and metallic blue look, and I think that's looking pretty nice. So now that I've given this a bit more shading with the airbrush, I can now come in and actually start gluing this to the base. So I've got that glued to a piece of MDF, so what I'm now doing is coming in with some plaster, and I'm just going to start filling in the gaps and making that look a bit more natural. Now that I've got that painted up, I can now come in with a mixture of sand and grout. Once that's all glued in place, that will give me quite a convincing earth-like texture. Now, one thing I wanted to have for this, which is completely pointless really because the model's mostly going to be displayed with the mask on, but I wanted to have the ability for the lights in the mask to go off when you take the mask off. I thought it'd be quite neat if that happened. So what I've done here is to put some wiring through the head. And the way I did that was to drill out the back of the head so it's hollow, so I can then drill a hole going from the neck up and then from the centre of the head out to the top of the head, and that just gives me a little bit of space in the back of the head to work with. What I've got is some springs that I've soldered to some wire, and they protrude from the top of the head, so when I put the mask on they connect with the contacts in the mask, and that feeds power to the LEDs in the mask. So when I put the mask on, the lights come on, and when I take it off, they go off. So I think that looks pretty cool. Nice little feature. Obviously not many will see it unless I'm there to actually take the mask off and show them. Nevertheless, I think that's quite a nice little thing. So there we go. It's always quite nice to revisit a project sometimes and just have another go at it and, you know, do something slightly different, and also obviously incorporate all of those ideas that you didn't quite get time for the first time round. So I think that's it. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting videos on future projects, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook. Just search for The Dark Power.